Okay, we're live. I will do my usual message in the comments to let people know that they should say hi as they join us. There we go. My internet's being just a little bit slower than usual, so give me a moment just to come off my Wi-Fi on my phone. There's that extra little backup. But we can get started with introductions and stuff in about a minute. We usually give people the time to get the notification on their phone that we've actually gone live. Oh, yeah, we've got Michelle's joined us already. Hi, Michelle. We usually get a lot of our wonderful 7030 ambassadors and our Hearts of Ace members joining us, Emma.
Cool. Oh, I saw Michelle come in and now she's gone on my screen. Hello, Michelle.
Oh, yes, that's me being able to put it up. I have control of the technology and can put things up on the screen.
No problem. That's good.
That's all right. So I think we'll let people join as they come in and see what they're doing. I think it'd be wonderful to do a little bit of an introduction and let people know what we're doing today. So we've done a number of different live streams now on the 7030 page in different ways. We've done quite a lot of ones looking at lived experience, but we've also done ones that are a little bit more specific to, let's say, putting all of that experience and expertise into practice, or a bit more on the research side. And particularly, we're often talking about how important it is to create trauma-informed communities as one of the major ways in which we can break cycles of trauma, of violence, and child abuse and neglect, etc. And as part of that, I know that we've done, for example, a previous live stream that was specific on trauma-informed schools with Aidan. And I'm very excited to be doing today's on trauma-informed universities. It's something I'm particularly passionate about. And it's wonderful to be able to introduce you, Emma, as we've been collaborating on this for a while now. But we are joined by Emma Davies, who has been working on trauma-informed universities as well. And I believe at more than one university. Isn't that right, Emma?
Yeah, I'm working on trauma-informed universities at University of East London and at Goldsmiths College, which is part of the University of London.
Thanks, Emma. And just for a little bit of context, as we usually have a slightly different setup, last live stream we experimented with having people send in their testimonies anonymously, and today Emma would prefer not to have her camera on, which is more than all right. We often encourage people to interact in the way that they're most comfortable. So I will be putting up some slides as well later for some visuals to help with a couple of the things we'll be chatting about if needed. So Emma, I'd love to hear from you, really, why you first became passionate about trauma-informed universities and kind of where you're at now with that as well.
So I started this, I was a program leader at the University of East London, and I was getting quite a lot of disclosures of various forms of adversity and various sorts of experiences, domestic violence, sexual assault, and a range of other things. And that got me thinking about why that might be. And my background has been to work in the Children's Commission's office and to work in public service in various ways around these kinds of issues. But I hadn't looked at it in terms of the academy. And then I get to the University of East London and I'm starting to get some of this stuff coming through and looking at just in response to questions like, how are you going? So kind of broad, open-ended questions. And that kind of fueled my interest as to whether there was other things going on. And one of the things that universities care about enormously is retention of students. And I was wondering whether some of the students that were struggling may well be struggling for some of the reasons and the issues at the heart of the Wave Trust. And so I started talking to other colleagues about it in different schools to try and get some sense of whether other people's experiences resonated with mine. And I found that they did. And so we started to think about what we could do with that. And this was anecdotal at that stage. And then I tried to get heard, and sometimes, as any of you here working in universities, sometimes that can be a bit tricky. And in terms of that, oh, that's just a few students. My sense was it wasn't just a few students. So what we did was set up a systematic survey. And a group of us got together from professional services and academic services in the university, and we developed a systematic survey. So we picked out the Adverse Childhood Experience questionnaire that many of you will probably know. We also used a resilience measure and an anxiety measure, and there are other things that have gone out of my head for the minute. And we pulled that together into a 12-minute survey. And we tried to get to all first-year undergraduate students, so level 4 students, as they would be seen in England and Wales. That was done in 2019-20, and that's now all published. And we spoke to 858 students responded to, level 4 students responded to that survey.
We might have some slides for that survey that might be useful for people to see. Let me see if I can get that out. Yes, I think this is the study, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. So here we go.
So there's the students, and that's the 2 publications, should people be interested. If you haven't got access to a university library to be able to access those, because they're not open access, we can provide you with copies. Email Hannah Abdullahi, whose email will come up a bit later. Oh, there it is. We can send you the published versions. They're available in in university libraries, but they may be harder to find elsewhere. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Absolutely.
So we found that UEL students on the whole survive significantly more childhood and recent adversities than the general population. So we were comparing it to things like Mark Bellis's survey around England and Wales, and we also looked at other universities too. There haven't been that many surveys, but there have been some. More than half reported 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, and 20% reported at least 6. 20% reported at least 6, which for those on this call, I suspect will be known to have a number of issues. Those cumulative experiences impacted students' projections about completion of their degrees. So we did ask the question, so remember these are first-year students now, we asked them how likely they were to complete their degrees. And we found a very, very high correlation with high levels of adverse childhood experiences and the likelihood that a student will complete their degree. That also correlated highly, perhaps less surprisingly for those on this call, I suspect, correlated highly with self-reported quality of life, experiences of anxiety, and self-reported physical and mental health.
And I think we might have some graphs on that on some of the next slides as well.
Okay.
Yes, I think this doesn't touch on that specifically. I might skip it and then we can come back to it if it makes sense. Yeah. But we've got, I think, for example, let me remove the email address so people can see that a bit more clearly. Here we go. We've got things like the life circumstances that people are going through.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, UEL is a widening participation institution, University of East London, and we have a number of marginalised students, many of which come from low socioeconomic backgrounds of one form or another. So it is very much a kind of second chance institution in a way. We also have a number of older students. So you can see that a number of our students, and I think overall at UEL from memory about 27%, so that was roughly right, of students have children. And of course that has huge implications in terms of intergenerational processes that we're aware of within this community.
Absolutely. And I think visually, I just wanted to show some other things. You also had a look at things that they had experienced in the previous 6 months, for example, that were stressors. That's
right. And those, so we used a World Health Organization measure to look at experiences in the last 6 months in terms of the kinds of things that people were experiencing. And indeed, deadline pressures was very high. And of course, there's more significant issues in there too, but more than half talked about significant stressful events in terms of deadline pressures, which actually at Goldsmiths has led to, in one school, a change in assessment deadline policies. So there are things that one can do, but of course the issues are cumulative. For those of you that are thinking about, how do I get started in a university, I think the relationship between students' projections about whether or not they'd complete their degrees and the number of adverse childhood experiences is really important for those in senior management positions in universities, because retention is really important. So retention means that somebody continues from level 4, first year, through to second year, and second year through to third year. So the idea of holding on to students so that they start their degree and indeed finish their degree is very important financially. And so given that very high correlation, that was a very powerful argument in the University of East London to enable us to be able to progress to where we're at now, some 3 years later.
Absolutely. And I think this is really what is so powerful about this study. It's being able to say, look, these are the things your students are having to deal with that are really getting in the way of their academic achievement, of their retention, and really highlighting the importance of all of these approaches that can actually help them succeed in many, many ways.
Yeah. And COVID also is an argument, I think. It's not one that I've used very much because I don't see this. I mean, this was done pre-COVID, and I don't see this as a COVID issue. But what has happened, I think, is as we start to, I mean, the pandemic's still going on, of course, but as we start to emerge through the pandemic, is that there is more focus on an understanding that to learn well and to study, one needs to be well. That's both mentally and physically. There's more understanding of that dimension of mental and physical health in relation to educational outcome than arguably there was pre-COVID. So that's another lever for those of you interested in thinking about how to do this. If I was starting today, I think that would be a lever I might use.
Absolutely. I think if anyone's looking for a little bit more information on how, for example, ACEs or mental health issues impact learning, or how trauma impacts learning, I believe Aidan spoke about it in a little bit more detail on our live stream on trauma-informed schools, as well, as there's obviously a large overlap there. And I think you should be able to find that both on our 70/30 campaign Facebook page, but also on our YouTube channel. I just want to see if there's any particular ones, as we're on the survey, of these slides that are also worth mentioning before I dive into a couple of other questions you've kind of set off in my mind there.
Yeah, so this is a straightforward something called a GAD-7. It's a standardized anxiety measure that is used in most mental health services, and we were finding very high levels of anxiety in a range of the population. So roughly just over a third were experiencing anxiety for several days, feeling anxious or on edge for the last couple of weeks. So again, that's something that fits comfortably in terms of our understanding of learning outcomes and people's ability to learn in terms of where their emotional space is, and that relationship between those anxiety measures and very high correlation between that and multiple adverse childhood experiences. Of course, for the idea that people have one adverse childhood experience is not as problematic, and of course this must be seen, I'm sure, in a whole range of these different webinars. It really is about accumulation of those experiences and multiplicity of those experiences, and then on top of that, often those stressful life events we just looked at overlaid onto those adverse childhood experiences. Can I pick up one of the questions in here as to what steps are being taken to help students?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I'm sure we could pick up some of the things that we are doing at UEL a little bit later. But for right or wrong, I've tended to focus our efforts on all students, not on students that are only those that have multiple ACEs, not because different students have different needs, and it's really important that we try and one of my goals anyway is to try and individualize education to the extent that we are able to within our large institutions. So trying to work with where students are at and what they need from their education system, their personal tutor, their academic advisor, wellbeing services, whoever it may be within the organization. But I've quite strongly moved away from the idea that we want staff to be looking for trauma, finding it, and targeting those particular students. I'm not convinced that that's in the interests of those students or indeed the broader community. So what we're trying to do is trying to get staff to be more compassionate, empathic, ask open-ended questions, supportive, which those kinds of interventions, and we can talk a bit more about the specifics of some of what we're doing in a minute, but those kinds of interventions are of as much use to all students. The difference will probably be how much people take up what, so what they choose to engage in. But I think it's a better angle than how we're going to support a particular group of students, because I think that risks some discrimination issues and some other issues that in unintended consequences that worry me. So I think it's important to look at it individually.
And I think this is something that overlaps with a lot of what we often say in our training about the fact that actually trauma-informed approaches end up helping everyone. You know, being listened to compassionately, or, you know, starting from relationships, etc., is something that benefits everyone. It just happens to be something that particularly benefits those with a history of trauma, and takes them that extra step further. And I think that very much comes through. And it also makes a difference. I think sometimes people are worried that if they only have a short amount of time with someone, that they won't be able to make a difference, because they have that impression of they need to be able to dive into, you know, that person's specific past to be able to make a difference, when it's actually often a case of leaving that person feeling empowered that makes a difference.
Yeah. Yvonne's come up with has talked about as a foster carer, knowing that young people who have been in the care system, so care experienced young people and students who are estranged from their parents, do get additional support. There are, you know, the UEL, the University of East London, does offer additional support if a student declares that they're a care experienced student or estranged from their parents upon entry. They will get more sort of case management coordination and support, and a little bit more financial support too. So those things do exist, but they are very targeted. And of course, many of the young people that we see, you know, given that data, have had multiple experiences, multiple adverse childhood experiences, and are not necessarily having been in the care system for at least, I think the criteria actually is have been in the care system for at least 16 weeks.
Right.
So there is that does exist. It's better at some universities than others, it has to be said.
That makes sense. I think before I move on to some of the other questions, I wanted to give a little bit more context as well to my personal interest in trauma-informed universities, Emma, because I know we've talked about this, but also because I think it's important to look at things from a student perspective as well occasionally. Yep. As I know that you've come in from it from a staff perspective. For those of you who don't know, my, I think, largest involvement in the 70/30 campaign was probably whilst I was a psychology student at the University of Aberdeen. And I really started off there trying to create a local trauma-informed community, and particularly focusing on the university itself, because that, as a student, that was where I had the most contact with people, the most power, the most understanding of the system around me. But also because I think very quickly I realized how important trauma-informed universities were. First and foremost, I think Emma's research really highlights how stressful a time it can be for students in different ways. And obviously there are certain universities, certain demographics that might differ across the UK, but I think we can definitely assume that there are many, many students who might be struggling with mental health or big changes or lots of things going on, especially with COVID having come around. But also I happen to have grown up in a household with lots of university lecturers, and therefore was also aware of the mental health tolls on staff. And beyond that, the really crucial thing was the fact that as a psychologist, I didn't see a lot of mention of adverse childhood experiences. or trauma was mentioned, but it was mentioned in the context of PTSD, not being framed as that kind of wider issue that links in with everything. And so I realized that universities are really training the next generation of professionals, be that healthcare professionals, psychologists, lawmakers, policymakers, educators, everyone else who's kind of moving on. Yeah. And it's really the chance to get them at that stage, make sure that they're walking into their new careers with that baseline, with that knowledge, rather than trying to catch them with training later on once they're already in contact with vulnerable people. Yeah. So that really kind of pushed me and motivated me to getting people on board. And I think I'd love to hear your thought on this as well, Emma, of how important it is to give students the possibility as well to be involved in that movement towards trauma-informed universities. And that I will say, before I let you jump in there, that I think that in all cases of making something trauma-informed, be that a school, be it a university, be it an organization, be it a whole community, you have to follow the opportunities that present themselves rather than just follow a template. So I'll put that caveat on it before I go back to you on the student's perspective.
I completely agree that we have to exploit opportunities where they present in a frame of where people are at. At the UEL, the University of East London, we've had students involved from the very beginning. So there were 10 interns involved in student interns who were paid for their time in phase 1 and 8 in phase 2, and there are currently 4. Our attempts at the University of East London in terms of voluntary work, so volunteers getting involved and the kind of stuff, is harder at widening participation in institutions, largely because people don't have time, because they're either doing their work or they're needing to do paid work to be able to support their time at university. Bearing in mind also that many are parents, roughly a quarter are parents, and the average age at University of East London is 27 at this stage. So it's older than one would get at, say, Goldsmiths, where the average age will be about 20 for the same cohort of students. So we've done it at the University of East London by building in internships, so building in paid employment, basically. But if it were possible, I would build it in through the student union and a partnership there. We did have a partnership with the student union in 2019-20. The president of the student union at the University of East London was very keen and was involved in the advisory group, etc. But actually getting voluntary labour to do the actual work with students proved very difficult. I don't want to lie, it proved very difficult. We tried a whole range of different ways. He tried a whole range of different ways, but it's difficult to get the time, basically, to be able to do that.
I fully agree. I think we need to recognise the different availabilities that come with people's roles. I know that when I was doing things at Aberdeen, students were particularly useful in terms of the amount of time that they could give compared to staff. So often staff had more power, but less time to dedicate to things. But staff were more consistent in their availability, whereas students would be able to do wonderful things for 2 months and then drop off during exam season or drop off during the summer, for example. And they would also maybe be able to do lots of things, but obviously were not staying at the university for prolonged, they'd stay there for years, but once they graduated, it's kind of that sudden loss. So if there was someone who'd taken on a particularly important role, it wasn't able to be maintained. So I think definitely follows where the opportunities go and see what works best, but there needs to be that kind of recognition of the different hurdles that come up based on wherever people are at and what responsibilities they do or don't have.
But hugely important. I mean, we have the minute we have a student advisory group, and if I can give you an example, there's 2. At the minute, we're producing 2 videos and a electronic interactive training resource for staff on trauma-informed practice in higher education. All of that, the scripts, draft scripts, and then the second script, and then the storyboard, all of that goes through the student advisory group, who give their detailed feedback, so that every resource that we produce and anything that we do has a student lens on it as well as a staff lens. So at the University of East London, we have a student advisory group and we have a staff advisory group. Sometimes they connect. We merge them. but sometimes we keep them separate. So we get different lenses and different frames on things. So today we had a student advisory group meeting this morning, for example, and we went through the second draft of a script and the second draft of a storyboard for a electronic resource. And one of the things that the students said was, this is all really great stuff. We need some examples, concrete examples from students to illustrate some of those points which they're now doing. So they are coming up with what they think needs to happen in context of that piece of work, and they're contributing that as interns. So it is a partnership. It doesn't always work as well as I'd like it to, don't get me wrong. It's difficult. Everybody has different things that they need to do. And so it's not always I'm not trying to pretend this is plain sailing. It's 2 steps forwards, 1 to the side, 1 backwards, 1.5 forwards. All that stuff is an inevitable part of a complex project to try and as a goal to try and create a trauma-informed institution. But I think that student voices are hugely important. So thank you for raising it as well.
No, absolutely. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there with the difficulty of complex projects. I think we know that this is both worth doing and that you can get there. But that doesn't mean that you lay out an initial action plan and there are no bumps in the road. I think it's important to say that, especially when we're encouraging people to, be getting involved and working towards creating trauma-informed communities, that they might come up against roadblocks, but that just means, taking a step back, understanding what would work better and keep going at it rather than giving up. So 100%, I think it's important to acknowledge that and be honest about it, or people can feel really lose a lot of their motivation, I guess, when they first come up against those hurdles.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I was having this conversation today. I think for those that are thinking about kind of where to start, for me, there's something about framing all this stuff in the terms of the people we're trying to persuade rather than the terms of what we know. And while that's probably obvious to everybody on this call, I think it's hugely important. So the things that universities care about are retention, employability, so graduate level employment, which will become a bigger metric for universities very soon. The government is putting a lot of pressure on universities in England and Wales at this point with quite a lot of regulation and change called their access and participation plan. Every university in England and Wales has to have an access and participation plan, sometimes called an APP, and they are public documents. So you can look up the university you're looking at and look at their access and participation plan, because that's how they'll tell you how the university is telling the government that they are going to respond to more marginalized students. So I went through the access and participation plan with a tooth comb, looking for where the synergies are and where we, as in those of us looking to create a trauma-informed institution, can do this work to enable senior managers in universities to be able to achieve their goals. And I think that's for me anyway, in terms of framing and advocacy, that's really important, rather than, well, we know this, this, and this, therefore you must do this, this, and this, because in their terms, unless it's going to meet one of their metrics, they might be compassionate and they might be interested because they have their own personal experience. And indeed, I have experienced that a few times. But overall, in terms of agency within their role, even if they're very senior in the institution, unless it meets their metrics, they're unlikely to act. So it's useful to look at what they're trying to achieve and marry what we're trying to achieve within that frame of reference.
100%, and I think we're always encouraging that approach. I know that Alex Williamson, who's led a lot of our political work, always very much brings that perspective when approaching politicians as well, of look at what they're interested in rather than why you think it's a good idea. And I couldn't agree more, really. It's what manages to get you on the same page, especially when you're the one approaching them. If you're able to adapt your message and really highlight what is relevant to them, that makes things much more smooth sailing, really.
Indeed.
And I wanted to pick up on what you'd said there about those kind of differences that are happening with the government and switching to, for example, the access and participation plan, and ask what are the kind of big changes that are happening at the moment that are affecting the university sector that people might need to be aware of or keep in mind, that they could either create more obstacles or they could use as opportunities to kind of start that contact and start that conversation?
I think it depends I think there's a number of different institutions, and I would kind of break them up in the sector. So if you're thinking about, if your local institution that you're thinking about is a post-92 institution, in other words, it became a university in 1992 when legislation changed, and it used to be a polytechnic, and the University of East London is an example of that, then graduate level employment, graduate employability is going to have much more importance than it has done to date. So if you think about it in terms of how these kinds of issues get in the way of graduate level employment, and obviously to get to graduate level employment, you have to graduate, and to graduate, you have to be retained at university. So those issues of retention and graduate level employment are retention has been an issue for some time. Graduate level employment is picking up. For high status institutions, it's a different ballgame. And Goldsmith sits somewhere in between. So if I use a high status institution like the University College London, UCL, they will be less concerned by these kinds of metrics from the government because they have enough international students and research income to be less worried about it. So they'll be more directive themselves. And in those kinds of institutions, I would be looking at their strategic plans and what it is that they are trying to achieve and looking at how to merge with those. I'd be less concerned by government metrics, although they will have to respond to government metrics. Most of the people that you connect with will probably not be interested in that or not know that, because broadly speaking, they're getting the income they need as an institution, so the pressure is less. So I think there is quite a big difference between those two in terms of which are those types of institutions, in terms of which arguments one would use. Every institution in England and Wales has to do an access and participation plan, and some institutions that are quite high status institutions are more interested than others. King's, Queen Mary's, those two universities in London, quite high status institutions, but more interested in these kinds of issues than probably some others. So it does depend on the institution and on what matters to the institution. And indeed, although these are institutions, as in a university is one institution, there are a huge number of different cultures within these institutions. Universities are not really one cohesive organization in a way. They're a set of independent fiefdoms often, and departments are kind of set up sometimes to compete with one another. So if you've got relationships in one department, that can be a way to start things moving. Depends where your relationships lie and which way you think it would be best to process it. But I'd certainly look at the goals of the people you're trying to influence. There's a question here, if I can answer, that William's asked.
I'll just make a last comment on what you said there, Emma, and then I'll read Will's out, because I think it's really important to really highlight how much of a difference you can make doing that little bit of research beforehand. For example, when I first went into this, I wasn't aware of those distinctions within the university types, etc. And I also will say, as you were mentioning, for example, having connections in different departments, there's many ways in. We might automatically think about leadership, and that's definitely a way in if you have those connections already. But for example, I was able to make a difference just connecting directly with some lecturers who are able to change their curriculum or include a trauma lens or mention ACEs and start those conversations off. Or you might have a way in with personal tutors, or it might be within a specific department, or it might be the student association. You know, there are all these different elements within the university that can be a way in. And obviously, ideally, you want it all to be linked up as a kind of end game. But the ultimate goal can sometimes be different to those first steps that you need to take to be able to make that change.
Yeah, relational. One of the roles in the university that can be useful in this is that there's a role, not all universities have got them, but more and more have now in England and Wales, and that's a Dean of Students. Mm-hmm. So kind of responsible for the what people define as the student experience. The deans of students can be good allies, depending on their frame. But I completely agree with you as well. Levering off pre-existing relationships or developing those relationships and then broadening from there is definitely a good bet.
Yeah, and I think William's just made a comment on that, kind of in the parallel within the political world. Kind of as you build those relationships, you start to understand what they're looking to achieve and are able to put that trauma-informed lens. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the question that Will had asked previously, which I will mention before I give it over to you, Emma, that one of the things that UEL is doing as part of becoming trauma-informed is getting that trauma-informed training out there, which WAVE is currently delivering. And so the voice of lived experience is very much built into that training from the contribution of our wonderful Hearts of Ace peer support group as well. So that's one of the little ways in which that is currently being worked in.
Yeah. And also, I mean, if you think about so when we advertise for internships or when staff get involved in this, so this is, I'm going to use a Bush term now. I need a better term than this. It keeps coming to my head, a coalition of the willing. It's an awful term because of all its synergies, all its things around Iraq. But anyway, the coalition of people that want to get involved is how we've built this up at UEL. So there's a number of people across professional and academic services within the organization that come together. And you will often find that the majority of people, unsurprisingly, who are interested in this work have themselves had those lived experiences, whether they disclose them at the beginning of their involvement or not. And so there are a lot of staff and a lot of students with those experiences who are embedded into a range of different projects within that we're doing. Our overview is Empowerment 360 is what we're calling it, but within that there's a number of different projects of which a number of staff have had lived experiences and a number of the students have had lived experiences of various sorts of trauma. So it's an inevitability and embedded into all of the work that we do. Almost all of the people who have put their hand up at some point have disclosed something.
And I think that is absolutely essential, really. It's a real strength of moving things forward, is having that, not only the research expertise and that scientific knowledge of why this matters, but also having those kind of more personal insights can be really, really valuable.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up, Emma, on a little bit around the language, because I know that we mentioned much earlier in our call how what really matters is that you're leaving someone feeling empowered rather than that you've specifically picked up on their trauma. And I know that you guys have chosen Empowerment 360 as kind of the name of your project. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about why empowerment specifically, why that element is so important.
It's in part, I mean, we're processing our way through actually at the minute. Trying to define empowerment is no mean feat. It's got a whole heap of the principles of trauma-informed practice around choice, around collaboration, around the trust. All those processes are almost foundations for empowerment, and that process of empowerment, it is a process, enables people to get more agency and control. We have gone down the route of empowerment as a kind of overarching process and then use the principles of trauma-informed practice. And we've actually used the ones from Trauma-Informed Scotland, but there are plenty of different versions of that. For those who haven't seen that work, though, Trauma-Informed Scotland has produced really nice reports. So we've kind of played on those in terms of what it is that we're doing. I've lost my track. Sorry, this slide threw me off. No, it's not. It's not. No, it's fine. What was the question again, Isabel? Sorry.
So on the importance of empowerment and why it's been the focus.
Okay, thank you. So there is a struggle in the university sector between a deficit model, which focuses on the negative, and an empowerment process which focuses on building strengths. Mm-hmm. And through my eyes, trauma-informed practice straddles the two. And the process of empowerment is a strength-building exercise. mindful of the experiences that people have. And many people have in all sorts of different ways, not only in their own generation, but multi-generationally, which I think is underexplored in terms of intergenerational processes of this stuff. But if we only went down the route of talking about it only in terms of trauma-informed practice, we would have lost quite a lot of engagement within the university for fear of the deficit model amongst marginalized students who have been badly treated through a deficit model in our schooling system. So there is a tension on that in many universities. And so Empowerment 360 was a way of working our way around that while holding a focus on trauma and a focus on empowerment and putting those together.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that a lot of trauma-informed efforts have come up with, because ultimately embedded in trauma-informed approaches is understanding of what empowers people, what builds their resilience, how they can handle all of those adversities, how people thrive. But obviously in that terms of first interaction that someone has with it, it doesn't come across just within the name. So there's definitely language considerations to have. And I think that's very much an example of where you take the understanding and you take the principles and see what is most appropriate in that situation rather than just work on a template. Because I know that...
Yeah, sorry, there was a lot of, we had a lot of consultation on that, a lot of students and staff involved in those discussions. And indeed, those discussions in themselves are fruitful, I think. So they're part of that journey in the sense that we have an understanding of the multiplicity of cumulative adverse childhood experiences and then later trauma for a number of students and a number of staff, quite high levels, I suspect, in staff, although we haven't got the systematic data, but I suspect it's quite high. But if we only do that and we put all our framing around that, those people that we're trying to influence within the university to change their practice to see students in more complex ways will be turned off by that for political reasons as opposed to anything else, I think. And also because of what's happened in the past. So you get caught in a discussion that that can get into polar opposites that isn't particularly helpful. I don't know if I've explained that very well.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think I've had all kinds of conversations. I've had conversations with people in the US. I've had conversations with people in Australia, conversations when I was in Aberdeen, when we were setting things up. We moved not only within the university did we have those conversations, but since when we were setting up a steering group. And I think there's very much a question of, it goes back to that research and that understanding of who you're interacting with, because some people feel that you're skirting around the issue if you're not focusing on trauma. Some people get put off by the deficit model, etc. But it's a conversation that needs to be had and something that needs to be looked into and understood when moving forwards. So 100%, I think we're very much on the same page for that. And I'm very glad that they were those conversations at UEL, as I think that's allowed you guys to move forwards at a much faster pace without having to come up against all of that resistance like further down the line.
Yeah, I think it has made it. It has helped. I mean, I'm not sure there's any end goal to this whole becoming a trauma-informed institution. It's a process and a journey, eh? So, but we've taken a few steps along that journey, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I think, as we always say, it's more of that process and ongoing. You can definitely see a difference from when you're not at all trauma-informed to when you're well onto the journey, but there's never a gold standard at which you can just call it quits and don't have to think about it anymore. There's always things that can be improved, always conversations that can change, and always situations which changing that you might need to be aware of in a different light.
Indeed. Can I pick up one here that I haven't mentioned? At the bottom, the balancing infrastructure, processes and relationships. This comes from Trauma Informed Scotland. But I think that's hugely important as our world becomes increasingly automated and our universities are very, very process driven. Lots of shared anonymous mailboxes where you need extenuation which means you can submit your assignment or whatever it is a bit late. Lots of anonymous mailboxes for whatever it is you need to do, and that will get more. There will be more and more of that over the next 5 years or so, as the technological revolution makes it cheaper to do that, and then they'll lose administrative staff, and that's already happening and will continue to escalate. For students who are struggling, who will be the same students often, not always, but often the same students who have experienced the issues at the heart of this, and have multiple ACEs, it's really, those relationships are absolutely core, trusting relationships to enable them to navigate the university and enable them to meet their goals within that university system. So trying to encourage universities in their planning to think about the way that they are, how process driven they are, and where they're going to put time for staff to have the time to give to students to build those trusting relationships which will enable those students to thrive at university, through my eyes, is probably one of our key challenges and one of the most difficult things that we need to do, because universities are struggling for money, just as all sectors are, and that relational work, through my eyes, is absolutely critical to enabling those students to succeed. You don't need loads and loads of trusting relationships, but they do need one, at least one or two, and those relationships take time to build, because of course that trust starts lower, as you well know. So there's a process to go through. So and none of that time in academic time as sort of personal tutors, academic advisors, which is often that space where that work would happen, none of that time with our most marginalized students is paid time for academic staff. It is just not accounted for in any workload model in the sector. So it's that seems to me to be our key challenge, and it's very difficult to work our way through. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is is looking at on the policy and institutional level, as well as on the support with the individual student, because our structures and our systems and our policies are what inform a lot of that individual relational work.
I think that's a really brilliant example, Emma, because we know how important relationships are. I think we're repeating infinitely on these live streams that healing happens in relationships, and the importance of, making sure that people who have experienced trauma have someone who believes in them, are able to create almost a new template of secure relationships through that. And I think being able to understand that actually there are very much structural hurdles towards achieving that need to be addressed, and you could have relationships as one of the important things that people should be spending their time on, is really important. I'm actually going to go to the next slide, as I know you had a wonderful graphic there that also kind of highlighted the importance of those relationships, and it's both about kind of building the relationships and maintaining them, but also being able to repair them. I'll let you describe this in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I was just trying to find different ways to communicate the importance of relationships in this stuff. So the proactive work that we're doing around Empowerment 360 is about the building and development of relationships in the early stages. But sometimes, inevitably, things go wrong. And I I have worked with many students, sometimes care experienced students, sometimes not, often with multiple ACEs, who will disappear and disengage, and then will want stuff, and they want it now, and they want it quickly, and sometimes they're asking for things in ways that is unlikely to get them what they need from the university, because they're quite angry, and then they'll disengage and disappear for a while, and then we go around that circle again. I think there's one person on this call that's a foster carer. I'm going to make a guess that that's behaviour she's seen many times before, and indeed it's a common journey, but sometimes that stuff leads to quite aggressive behavior, or sometimes it leads to complaints of one form or another, and students aren't getting heard on what they need. So we have at the minute in most universities in England and Wales, as far as I'm aware, we have a very adversarial system of complaints and of student misconduct processes. So much the same as we do in our criminal justice system, we tend to like adversarial, punitive processes. And One of the things that we're piloting, we've just got the money to do across 3 universities, UEL, Goldsmiths and Warwick University, is we're piloting a restorative justice process to manage some student misconduct and student complaint. The theory is that by being heard and by repairing those relationships and looking at where harm was done and how that harm can be resolved, so alternative dispute resolution, in terms of restorative justice, we believe that we can shift some of that so that that becomes a learning opportunity and also doesn't increase shame and humiliation and brings stuff back, brings those students back into an active and proactive learning environment. So that argument has been brought at those 3 universities as a pilot. And then we'll see whether we can from there think about, UEL is certainly thinking about changing some of its policies in terms of restorative justice and working its way through for some student misconduct that is relational. So just trying to think of different ways, and I suppose this is another example in a way, that one is another example of a process and system change as opposed to just individual support, looking at how our processes and systems enable or inadvertently disempower and disable particularly our most marginalized students. So trying to think through what we need to do and how to enable that to happen, and the kind of thinking about it in terms of the basic public health stuff of building, maintaining and repairing relationships seems to have been a way that communication has worked with some within the senior management team.
Wonderful. And I think definitely as I'm currently focusing a lot on the criminal justice system within my work with WAVE, understanding that the shift between punitive approaches and restorative approaches needs to happen in not, beyond that sector is really quite interesting. And I think that's a great example of how it's not just a case of training people in trauma-informed approaches, or it's not just a case of targeting specifically students who've had ACEs, but there's all these different changes that we can do within a university that actually move us closer to being supportive and trauma-informed. So I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it. I'm seeing that we've also got another question from Will here on whether or not universities have trauma-trained counsellors. I think I can happily answer in terms of there is no consistent situation across the UK. I know that when I was a student at the University of Aberdeen, they had counselling services, but they were more that general talking counsellors with a certain number of free sessions. I know that this has since changed during COVID, but there was certainly no standard for anyone who was in a much more crisis situation. What's the situation like now in UEL, given all of these changes that are happening?
There is some element of, there's been quite a lot of change in recent times. So I'm not sure where it'll go under the new head. We're in sort of transition time. A lot of, that's absolutely right, Isabel, of course, that there's no consistency across the sector in this. A lot of universities are offering largely well-being services. Well-being services are not trained professionals. They are well-being services. I was quite shocked when I first did a grant for some of this stuff at UEL, looking to increase the amount of trauma-informed counsellors at the university, to find that there weren't any to increase. So in the early stages, so there is now a little bit more. There are some trained counsellors, but the majority of wellbeing teams at universities do not have any trained staff at all. They have a bit as a, so they are a triage system, if you like, and then you might get some counselling in the way that Isabel just talked about at Aberdeen. That's certainly the case at Goldsmiths, that there are counsellors at Goldsmiths, but they're not seen by all, and there's nowhere near the resource to match the demand. So that's a trained counsellor, full stop. And now you've added on, of course, the notion of a trauma-informed trained counsellor, a trauma-trained counsellor. There will be some, it's patchy. There will be some that will be able to do trauma-informed CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy. We did do a pilot at UEL of use of EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy, on the basis that they are the 2 therapeutic interventions that have been shown in research terms anyway to have the most effect. But actually it is a lot of it is quite Rogerian, as you say. A lot of it is quite is the kind of talking therapy stuff, which is really important. I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from that, and indeed being heard by academic advisors or personal tutors, so that's the academic side of pastoral support, or indeed wellbeing services. All of that is hugely important. But whether I could put my hand on heart and say that many universities, if indeed any universities, have got a really skilled trauma-informed well-being service that has qualified counsellors and psychologists. The bottom line is that universities just don't have the money for this. And that will be the case, I suspect, at all universities, that demand will outstrip supply for any form of trained mental health professional within the university system, and that has got worse under COVID. That said, there's more emphasis on it under COVID, so it might be that we see a little bit more of that. But trying to get counsellors to have more understanding of the trauma and of the issues at the heart of this is another journey in its own right. At University of East London, I received absolutely no resistance whatsoever from the wellbeing team or the counsellors. Indeed, they could not have been more supportive of this project from day one.
I had a similar experience in Aberdeen, where I think the counselling service was probably the first who were happily on board and wanted to get involved. And I think just simple things that they were happy to do straight off were have leaflets on adverse childhood experiences and trauma, for example, in the waiting area, along with all of the ones around, you know, substance abuse, eating disorders, and whatever else they already had there, to give a bit of more information to anyone who came through. So I think they're definitely worth approaching, even if they aren't already trauma informed. And I will say, in terms of personal experience, for example, they were very helpful on, you know, academic stressors. They were really good with bereavement. They were really good with those smaller kind of life changes situations. But when looking at complex trauma, it was a case of, we don't have the time and resources to be able to fully build up this relationship. We can listen and we can refer you on, but that was about where they were at the time. So yeah, I think we go back to whether or not it's funded enough and whether or not you have that kind of trained staff available. Looking at the time, I think I kind of wanted to finish off really saying that universities are so important when looking at trauma-informed approaches. They are, as the general population, but in generally, will be strongly affected by trauma, both for students and staff. But they are also that kind of first step in training up the new generation of people who really need to be trauma-informed. So when we're looking to create that change within society, they are really key place to get started. And I wanted to thank you, Emma, for coming on and sharing everything that you guys are already doing at UEL, because I know from the comments and from some of the conversations I'd had before our live stream today that your insights are really interesting, but also very useful in bringing these steps forward and making sure this spreads more widely.
Thank you. There's one thing I didn't mention that I'm regretting not mentioning. Am I allowed to mention one more thing?
Go ahead.
One thing I'm really pleased that we're doing is a drama project called Still I Rise. And sometimes we talk about this in terms of counselling and those kinds of issues, which are hugely important, don't get me wrong. But some of the drama work that's been going on at UEL, both in the drama department and in some of the stuff that we've commissioned in terms of voice and people telling their stories in ways that feel safe for them and good for them, has been really interesting and can be very, very powerful. So that voice work, for want of better expression, is really not to be dismissed as part of this journey, as well as the support and counselling type side of it. It's just a slightly different angle on those amplifying marginalised students' voices, which enables them to feel heard and stronger.
I think that's a great example, Emma. Thank you for reminding, or for remembering to bring that up, because I think one of the big shifts from what might be seen as a traditional viewpoint to a trauma-informed viewpoint is understanding that healing doesn't just happen within therapy, doesn't just happen in those kind of crisis situations. And I think that's a great example of the ways that it can shift. And kind of talking about what is happening at UEL, I'm just going to share slides here for a second to say that we've got a virtual event coming up on the 16th of June with UEL. I'll be talking there within the community of practice about trauma-informed approaches in a little bit more. And we'll also have a wonderful conference on the 14th of July where WAVE will be very lucky to be doing a workshop, I believe.
Yeah.
Emma, do you want to say a little bit more about the conference? I will say to anyone who's interested in either, please do email Hannah. Again, I've put her email address there so you can find out a little bit more. But would you like to explain what the conference is in a bit more detail, Emma?
Yeah, so the conference is about trauma-informed practice in higher education, and we're lucky for it to be opened. We're doing it in partnership with Nottingham Trent University. Nottingham Trent are doing some interesting research around staff experiences of trauma and lived experiences, and they will be presenting their work there. We have the Nottingham MP that will be opening the conference because she's interested in policy on these issues more broadly. Public Health Newham are also going to be doing some talking about it because they are going on this journey in terms of trauma-informed practice. And then we have a number of speakers that will be talking from different spaces and workshops where we're thinking about trauma-informed practice in higher education. It's a one-day conference on the 14th of July at the University of East London in Stratford. There's lots of public transport and it's free, and you are more than welcome to come. So if you would like further information, then please don't hesitate to contact Hannah Abdullahi at uel.ac.uk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You're seeing lots of thank yous in the comments as well. Emma, it was wonderful to have you on today, but to everyone else, have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Good luck.